think, Marge. All I need is a title.
In this video, we will examine the historical, sociological, economic, and archaeological science behind the story of the biblical Exodus, with the goal of explaining why these scientific fields prove that the story did not happen. Now, the theistic believer might attack this statement, saying that if we were pursuing honest science, we should approach the subject matter from a more neutral, objective framework. The problem with that approach is that while examining source materials from scholarly journal articles, articles published in newspapers, and even some articles published in theist magazines, we come across authors who want to believe the biblical story, but they also point out that there is no scientific evidence that the Exodus actually happened. And then they go on with their article. So we will present our hypothesis on the subject, that the biblical Exodus story from the birth of Moses to the Hebrew conquest of the lands of Palestine was fabricated out of whole cloth. The scale of these falsehoods wrapped up in the story has gotten to the point that even rabbinical scholars have stated that the Exodus did not happen. In 2001, Rabbi David Wolpe stated, quote, "The way the Bible describes the Exodus is not the way it happened, if it happened at all," unquote. This is, of course, an amazing statement, coming as it did from a practicing rabbi, and it caused quite a stir when it was said. Volpe stated that the historicity of the reported event should not matter, since religious faith is not founded upon the same basis as empirical facts. And in that, he is completely correct. Volpe went on to state that his views on the subject were based on the fact that there is no archaeological evidence of the Jews wandering through the Sinai desert, and numerous archaeological digs at sites where the Bible claimed there were supposed to be settlements have turned up nothing. However, it gets better. There are archaeological digs in Egypt that uncovered a number of people who had been buried with their hands bound behind their backs. One of the archaeologists, a theist, argued that this proved that the ancient Hebrews had been living in the area because these buried people apparently were slaves. The problem is that there is no proof of this. There is nothing ruling out other potential explanations, such as the possibility that this is where the local town or city buried those executed by the state, no matter their crime or status. This same source then went on to claim that Egyptians started building houses based on a structure favored by ancient Hebrews, but they then never proved that assertion, nor linked it to any mass migrations of people out of the region. Simply stating that a building style was favored by some group, and then stating that these structures fit that style, does not actually mean that they were built by that group. In a 2005 article published in Bible and Spade, Dr. Brian Janeway states that, quote, "This story is one that has been repeated time and time again throughout more than a century of excavations in the Holy Land. It involves a tendency to make claims based upon incomplete evidence and fails to account for the principle that absence of evidence does not equal evidence of absence," unquote. That argument can work both ways, as in the above case where theist archaeologists have taken a few interesting findings and woven them into the fabric of the narrative that they want to be true. The problem is that absence of evidence equals the absence of reason to believe. It may very well be that some of what has turned up in the Egyptian desert has been evidence of ancient Hebrew habitation, but real science does not make a claim about something until there is evidence for it. Once that is done, scientists then test the evidence to confirm it or disprove it. This is how a number of discoveries in the human fossil record were disproven as frauds, as in the case of the Nebraska Man or Piltdown Man. Please note, however, that while scientists recognize these as fake, theists still point to them as examples where science got it wrong, and then use them to attempt to disprove evolution. Other theists, writing 2 years earlier in the same publication, bemoan the limitations of archaeology to, quote, make a detailed and correct view of the events depicted in the Bible emerge, unquote. But that is exactly what the archaeological science will eventually do, because if we have not found it yet, it should still be out there waiting to be found, exempting someone destroying artifacts and such. However, the correct view of the biblical events may not coincide with the Theists' view, as we have seen by examining the evidence coming out regarding the Exodus. Other Theist scholars have tried to edit the events of the Exodus itself to make the story more plausible. In the case of Richard E. Friedman, he states that the Exodus only included members of the Levite clan, the religious elites of the ancient Hebrew tribes. While I'm sure that Friedman was simply trying to help the Theist cause, his proposition does almost more harm than good. So let's get this straight. Only one tribe out of the 12 left Egypt for Canaan, and they numbered roughly 600,000 men as stated in the Bible? That hypothesis skews the numbers completely out of reality because, assuming roughly the same population for the other 11 tribes, you would have a total population somewhere between 7 and 7.5 million people, which would have vastly outnumbered the entire population of Egypt. But without all those numbers, Friedman is saying that the Levites left their brethren in captivity in Egypt. If that is the case, why bother celebrating the Passover, since God only let one tribe out of 11 go? In a 1987 article written in the Washington Post, H. Shanks provides both points of view on the argument of the historicity of the Exodus. In arguing for the Exodus, Shanks points to the existence of the kingdoms of Moab, Edom, and Ammon, which ancient Hebrews encountered when they migrated into Canaan. And these kingdoms became continued rivals for the kingdoms of Israel and Judah in the biblical narrative. Shanks also points to Hans Godek, a world-famous Egyptologist and former chairman of the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, who at one point claimed to have found a contemporaneous account of the Exodus from the Egyptian point of view. The ruler states in the text that she has finally dealt with some immigrants who, quote, disregarded the tasks assigned them, unquote. She went on to say, quote, that the earth swallowed their footsteps, which Godek took to mean that the Hebrews went to a watery death. Shanks points out that these statements did not specifically mention the Hebrews, and even if it did, the statements go completely against the biblical narrative. However, it might be understandable that the Egyptians spin the events to downplay any failures on their part. Assuming that other nations would have some way of finding out what's going on elsewhere, it would not do for foreign governments to discover that such a massive exodus of people left Egypt with all the massive economic and social damage that would entail. It is said that the victors write the history, but in this case, it was the only ones remaining who wrote the story from the Egyptian point of view, if that's what happened. So, as you can see, there are a lot of problems with the story of the Exodus, and that's only while examining sources who believe that the events happened. They make baseless claims or assertions, they whine when the science is not perfected enough to reveal the truth as they see it, they contradict the Bible by inventing a new narrative that leaves most of the ancient Hebrews enslaved in Egypt, or they point to other stories claiming that they might involve, mention, or be about the ancient Hebrews. These are theist rats trying to save the sinking ship that is the Exodus story. When we examine the Exodus story from the point of view of skeptics, it becomes even more clear that the tale has some major problems. First, let's take my own unscientific speculation, which is based on what we already know about this portion of the Bible from earlier episodes of the Atheist Bible studies. We know that the Tower of Babel story was written by ancient Jewish scholars who were prisoners in Babylon, where the largest ziggurat to the god Marduk was being constructed. We know from research done by skeptics such as Aaron Ra that the flood of Noah referred not to a worldwide catastrophe that simply could not have happened, but to a local flood of the Iraqi floodplain that covered the area in roughly 22 feet of water. Aaron Ra has also stated that the character of Moses was a composite character, a person with combined aspects from several other characters who did exist, including Hammurabi, who did come up with a code of laws. The birth story of Moses is also taken almost completely from the birth tale of the Akkadian god Sargon II, who was also put in a reed basket made from the same materials and set adrift on a major river. The point here is that all of these stories shared a common thread. They all either referenced directly or had something to do with Mesopotamia, where the Iraqi floodplain, the city of Babylon, and the kingdom of Akkad were all located. This would seem to indicate that the story of Exodus may have initially been written down during the time of the Babylonian captivity, when the Jews were held prisoner in the Babylonian capital. Before that, the Exodus story may have been a collection of disparate verbal tales or oral traditions passed around the ancient Hebrew people. Egyptologist Ashraf Izzat picked apart the Exodus story in his book, Egypt Knew No Pharaohs Nor Israelites. In the book, and in videos produced about the book, he makes the following statements. First, no one referred to the leaders of Egypt as Pharaoh. Not the leaders, not foreigners, not priests, nor the common people. A comment to the writings of ancient historians such as Herodotus, Strabo, and Plutarch, each of whom made detailed writings about the geography and society of ancient Egypt, people referred to the leaders of Egypt simply as kings. Also, while the Bible refers to Egypt as a tyrannical land where the ancient Hebrews were held in slavery, the biblical narrative does not take the historic geography or society of the land into consideration, almost as though the biblical writers never knew about it. For instance, the pyramids, which were a couple thousand years old at the time, were not mentioned in the Bible, even if it was simply to say, Egypt, the land of the great pyramids. Also forgotten was the fact that Egyptian society was not well suited for slavery. Slaves, especially in the numbers reported in Exodus, would have damaged Egyptian society. Slavery in Egypt was mostly limited to indentured servitude, with the slave working off a debt. Some of the wealthy members of society may have owned slaves, but in fact, as Izzat points out, widespread slavery would have wrecked the practice of indentured servitude. Also, the following is an excerpt from the book, which points out a serious flaw with the biblical narrative. The whole of ancient Egypt would have converted to the cult of the Israelites, which later evolved into Judaism instantly after their God revealed his might by destroying their land and its king. But the truth of the matter is that Egypt did not convert to Judaism at any time in its long history. Try to imagine yourself amongst the ancient Egyptians who had survived the devastation of the 10 plagues. You had witnessed firsthand the might of the God of the Israelites as he revealed himself through the plagues, a zombie-like rampage during which armies of frogs, lice, flies, hail, and locusts were unleashed, and the water had turned to blood before the whole land finally was shrouded in thick darkness. Yahweh had plainly shown to the Egyptians the utter impotence of their gods, and demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt his power over them. If you were an Egyptian, gawping at the miracles as they unfolded with trembling legs and tears dribbling from your eyes, what would your reaction be? Humbled by the might and revelation of Yahweh, certainly you would have gotten down on your knees and implored Yahweh for forgiveness as you renounced the impotent Egyptian deities and converted wholeheartedly to the religion of the Israelites and their mighty God. Yet none of this happened, nor were any of these events recorded outside of the Bible. Ashraf Izzat states in his book that the ancient Hebrews did not have any history in the areas of Palestine and Egypt, and basically, those chunks of the first 2 books of the Bible are completely false. He proposes an alternative to the Bible narrative that explains the origins of the ancient Hebrew people. At points throughout his book, Izzat states that while some aspects of the biblical narrative are not native or familiar to Egyptian culture, it could have been derived from ancient Arabian culture. Personal names such as Noah, Joseph, and Moses have Arabic sources. The same could be said of place names such as Canaan, which was a derivative of an ancient Arabian tribe. This, and the lack of such derivatives in Egyptian culture or geography, suggests to Ashraf Izzat that the ancient Hebrews actually originated in the region of southwestern Arabia, specifically northern Yemen. From that point, you could then read the Bible a bit more realistically, stripping out the more fanciful elements that were simply made up. With this in mind, the events of Genesis that made up the life story of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph could have happened in the region of northern Yemen. Joseph being sold into slavery in Arabia, where slavery was prevalent, makes much more sense. Here's where Izzat and I diverge, because I do think there was an Exodus, just not from Egypt. The crossings of the Red Sea never happened, nor did the creation of the 10 Commandments, because these 2 things are the most miraculous aspect of the Exodus story. So what is left is that the ancient Hebrews were enslaved in northern Yemen. They grew to some large population under this bondage. They escaped and fled northward into the Arabian desert. The trek took roughly 40 years to complete, and the Hebrews ended up in Palestine, demolishing the Midianites in the process. They then renamed the land after their old tribal name, which is why the name Canaan did not appear in any Egyptian records, because the land did not exist yet. So why the miracles? Well, Ashraf Izat has some thoughts on that, and I have the other side of the story, which goes to motivation. Izat points out in his book that the ancient Hebrews had a localized religion, more like a cult. They never expected this cult to become anything like what it has become today, one of the world's largest religions. So during this time, and during the time covered by the narrative of the books of the Old Testament, the entire religion could have been carried forward by oral traditions and such. Then Palestine was taken over by the Babylonians, and the Hebrews were taken captive. While being held captive, the Jewish people, of course, hated their captors, and this was reflected in the writings of the Jewish intellectuals who wrote the first few books of the Bible, which were written down during the Babylonian captivity. Now, miracles don't do much for a group of people with a regional tribal religion. However, when you want to puff yourselves and your God up, when you want to make the statement that your God is bigger than the gods of the captors, and so forth, you might embellish the oral traditions and make your God appear as powerful as possible. As you can see, there is ample scientific evidence that the Exodus story is completely false. It has gotten to the point that only the fringes of Christianity and Judaism still believe that the Exodus happened as the story was written in the Bible. Most other people feel that the story is an allegory. This is important, however, because there are some important reasons that people still cling to the Exodus. Various people in the Israeli government state as fact that Israel is a few thousand years old, and they point to the Exodus story as the founding of their people. To have this removed from their history, I think, means that Israel is little more than just any other country. It is unfortunate that people hitch their national histories to biblical narratives that are easily falsified.